So in this video on Hatshepsut, we'll be looking at a concept called the Heiress theory. Now, the Heiress theory is a theory that was used to try and understand why the kings married their sister during this time period, and tries to explain that the reason the kings had to marry their sister was because they were actually the heiress, that the power of the blood, of the family blood from the earlier kings and queens was actually passed down through the female side of the family, and that the male son had to marry his own sister, commonly his own sister, who was actually the heiress, to legitimize his throne, so that he could only really become king if he married his sister, who had the royal the bloodline of the royal hierarchy. So it's been called a matrilineal succession or a matrilineal hierarchy. That is therefore passed down from time to time. It's also been used in Hatshepsut's case to try and explain why she felt that she should claim power, so to justify her claim to the throne over the top of her nephew Thutmose III. So let's start by having a look at the family tree and understand how this makes sense. So if we start right at the top here with Hatshepsut I, and we move all the way down, we see Ahmose Nefertari, her daughter, and then her daughter Meritamen, and then her daughter or sister Ahmose, and then Hatshepsut, and then even beyond that to her daughter Neferure. We can see an unbroken line of these royal women all the way through to the 17th dynasty. And that's what it means by matrilineal succession. So if we imagine that the power is actually flowing through these women, or the bloodline is actually, being the heiress flows through these women, so therefore second Enraytau the second had to marry Hatshepsut I to legitimize his claim. Ahmose had to marry Ahmose Nefertari. Amenhotep I had to marry Meritamen. Okay, that had to happen for them to legitimize their claim to the throne. Otherwise, they wouldn't be considered the true king. That's the crux of the Heiress theory, trying to explain why these kings would marry their full-blood sister or even half sister. It gains even more significance when we look at Hatshepsut's time period, because Thutmose I, her father, was not from the royal family at all, so he did need to marry into the royal family to legitimize his claim. That's for sure. And then his son has potentially even less claim to the throne, if you take this argument further, because he has absolutely no Ahmosid blood in him at all. So he was born from Mutnefret, who's not from the royal family, not from the Ahmosid line, and neither is Thutmose I. And then taking that further, Thutmose III was born from a concubine Isis, and his father Thutmose II. So they can't trace any lineage all the way back to the earlier Ahmosids, whereas Hatshepsut's daughter Neferure perhaps can. So that's the idea behind the Heiress theory. Originally used it to justify why these kings would marry their sister, but also used during Hatshepsut's time to suggest why she felt she had more claim to the throne than Thutmose III did, because she felt perhaps that she had more royal blood. Now, even though a number of historians have used this as a way of trying to understand, have put forward the Heiress theory as a way to try and understand this for quite a long period of time, we're going to attribute it to an historian called Donald Redford, because he still kind of pushes this notion forward. And we'll just look at the red section here. Donald Redford believes Hatshepsut's attainment of the throne represents the final attempt in the 18th dynasty to establish a strong matriarchate in Egypt. He cites the unusual importance of earlier queens in this period, such as Tetisheri, Hatshepsut I, and Ahmose Nefertari, as evidence of such a tendency, and then goes on to suggest that it might have even come from Nubia. He got the concept from Nubia. So the main part there is in the red, that it was a final attempt in the 18th dynasty to establish a strong matriarchate in Egypt. So in other words, Hatshepsut was trying to become the next king and be a female king, and off the back of what these other queens had been doing. So Donald Redford still kind of suggests that this is a tendency, that the Heiress theory is still kind of going on, whereas most other historians no longer subscribe to the Heiress theory, no longer believe in it. I've got another section here from the Women's Studies Encyclopedia from Volume 1. And if we have a look here, we can see that the Heiress theory, the commonly held belief that the right to the throne in Egypt passed through the female line, and the king had to legitimize his position by marrying the royal heiress, the daughter of the previous king and his principal wife, and ordinarily his own full and half-blood sister, dates to the 19th century. So even though this is it's been around since the 1800s, we're going to attribute it to Redford, because he's still subscribing to that theory. So what we need to understand it's founded on incorrect assumptions about Egyptian society. So it's misconceptions about Egyptian society. And the person who we're going to use to argue against Donald Redford is Gay Robbins. And Robbins has mounted a persuasive case against the evidence for the theory. Its correctness should no longer be assumed. So we can no longer really subscribe to the Heiress theory, but we do need to know it, and we do need to argue about it when we're talking about Hatshepsut and why she felt she should come to the throne. It demonstrates a good level of knowledge for us. So here's Gay Robbins, and she disagrees with the Heiress theory, and this is what she says. She says that there is a marked tendency, even in the 18th dynasty, for kings to marry royal family members, though they were not always the king's daughter, and comments that the kingship at least was intended to belong to a dynastic family, arguing that there was a preference where possible for dynastic purity. So in other words, she says, yes, they did marry, and it was common, and that's normal, but that the king had to be related to a dynastic family. That was really important, had to belong to a dynastic family, and that there was a preference where possible for dynastic purity, but that does not mean that the Heiress theory is true. So she doesn't agree with the Heiress theory, just that, yes, it was important that the king had a relationship to the dynastic family, but not that there's an unbroken line of matriarchs. Joyce Tildesley also disagrees with the Heiress theory. And we've got a little quote from her as well. The old heiress princess theory, which stated that the right to rule was passed through the female line, compelling the crown prince to marry the heiress sister, is now discredited. So we can use her as a little quote there to support our response. So I hope that kind of makes a bit of sense about the heiress theory.